This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today I'd like to speak about some of the peculiar developments of our time that are influencing countless young people as they come of age. And I'd like to focus on it from the perspective of young people who are striving spiritually. And of course that has a very general sound to it, but we'll get more specific as we go through this episode. And I'd like to focus on two major developments that I think could be characterized in one way, from one perspective, as a kind of intensification of contraction on the one side, of urgency and pressure, and on the other side, a kind of expansion, dissolution in a way, but also a kind of liberation. And these two movements are familiar to everyone. You may already be thinking about what I mean to talk about today. And they were aptly described in the opening of Ready Player One, the book from Ernest Cline that became a movie that's quite well known. And I'd like to start by sharing selections from the opening of that book. The main character is introducing his story and the situation, and one of the things that he says he really wishes were the case, or that someone had just been honest with him about the situation that he was born into. And first of all, talking about fairy tales and in relationship to religion and spirituality. You may have heard of a super powerful dude named God who lives up in the sky. The whole God thing's actually an ancient fairy tale that people have been telling one another for thousands of years. We made it all up, like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. A little later, talking about how he came to understand the development of civilization, he writes, "After fighting a bunch of wars with each other over land, resources, and our made-up gods, we eventually got all our tribes organized into a global civilization. But honestly, it wasn't that organized or civilized, and we continued to fight a lot of wars with each other. But we also figured out how to do science, which helped us develop technology. For a bunch of hairless apes, we've actually managed to invent some pretty incredible things. Computers, medicine, lasers, microwave ovens, artificial hearts, atomic bombs." He goes on, "But that's where the bad news comes in. Our global civilization came at a huge cost. We needed a whole bunch of energy to build it, and we got that energy by burning fossil fuels, which came from dead plants and animals buried deep in the ground. We used up most of this fuel before you got here, and now it's pretty much all gone." And a little later, "It turns out that burning all those fossil fuels had some nasty side effects, like raising the temperature of our planet and screwing up the environment. So now the polar ice caps are melting, sea levels are rising, and the weather's all messed up. Plants and animals are dying off in record numbers, and lots of people are starving and homeless. And we're still fighting wars with each other, mostly over the few resources we have left. To be honest, the future doesn't look too bright. You were born at a pretty crappy time in history, and it looks like things are only going to get worse from here on out." And just a little further on, he says, "Maybe it isn't a good idea to tell a newly arrived human being that he's been born into a world of chaos, pain, and poverty just in time to watch everything fall to pieces. Luckily, I had access to the oasis, which was like having an escape hatch into a better reality. The oasis kept me sane. It was my playground and my preschool, a magical place where anything was possible." So here we have described these two gestures in this book from Ernest Cline. One, a gesture of contraction, which is related to not only the climate crisis, but ecological crisis in general, growth of population on a finite planet, and the finitude of all resources on the planet. And this feeling of kind of pressure and contraction in a kind of de-spirited or unspirited world that is headed towards increasing strife and catastrophe. And I think he brings this imagination, which I think a lot of young people are living with all over the world today, not only young people, of course. And then on the other hand, he introduces the oasis. And the oasis, I'm not going to read much more about it, but it's comparable to the internet, virtual reality. And this possibility that has emerged through the digital revolution of a certain type of expansion, a kind of liberation, kind of freeing oneself from all of the pressure around being a creature on the earth in a collective situation where we need to work together and also deal with real pressing issues. And it's a kind of release valve for him, where he also finds a possibility to develop himself. And this is, of course, one way that the digital revolution we can understand it this way, which is there's an unbelievable ability to connect all over the world. At this point, technology has reached remarkable affordability, and many of the limitations that a generation 50 years ago might have come of age with are gone in certain ways for young people who are growing up with digital technology. And so it's interesting because also these two dynamics are kind of working against one another. I mean, when we think about the capacity to form a judgment about the value of a glass of clean water, or even of a pile of firewood, or a certain bowl of grain that we might be eating for breakfast in our porridge, how much judgment do we have in understanding the value of those foundational parts of our lives today, when we spend a lot of time in a kind of pseudo-virtual world where those kind of limitations are not schooled in us. And so in a way also this judgment of just being on the earth and being able to judge relative values of things, how much, even how much one might pay for something like a quart of firewood in a certain area around the earth. Those kind of things are certainly not to be taken for granted today, that we can make that kind of a judgment. And so we can see that there's a huge tension that young people are growing up in, because there's this pressure around issues, and not only ecological issues, but we also have to look at the whole questions around social justice, which also come in Ernest Cline's book when he refers to homelessness and war and strife. And all of that also is something that we would eventually have to have some capacities in, statecraft, working together in groups and organizations. These are things that are necessary for life on Earth, and we're at a point where they are going to be even more and more necessary. And at the same time, we've developed a technology which kind of offers an ability for us to expand our consciousness, but in a way that doesn't clearly dovetail with developing our judgment on the earth. So there's kind of movements going in two different directions. And this is an uncomfortable place to be, I think. And for young people who value and care about the future of the planet and the future of social relationships on the planet. And this is where also I think it's possible to make, another observation about the digital revolution, which I already did in a previous episode, which focuses on some of the nuances of the kind of connectivity that it offers to us. Because in a way, it's almost trite to say we're more connected than we ever were before. And yet, as is being shown also, there's a huge possibility and even tendency through the use of digital technology to isolate ourselves. Now I'm thinking mostly about the internet and social media sites, but also video gaming and even just YouTube or Netflix, video streaming platforms. This kind of array of offerings, in one way it totally expands the horizon where we can expand our consciousness, but in another way it's a kind of connection that only goes to a certain depth usually. And it can have the effect that also, which I've just indicated, when we unplug and we just come back to normal day-to-day life, that we don't feel necessarily really connected or able to connect with it. Maybe even some of our abilities to judge have gotten weakened or haven't been exercised enough, so we don't feel as sensitive to the surroundings that we're in, the people that we're in. This is one of the observations that Sherry Turkle ends her study Alone Together with. When she describes how a lot of the young people who were some of the first to really interact a lot with digital technology, how they kind of felt it was just too demanding then to interact with people in real space, and they preferred to actually have mediated digital exchanges. They didn't really have the need or the inclination to spend real time together and without devices or without digital mediation of their communication. And she also anecdotally shares that many psychotherapists and psychiatrists and psychologists and also social workers just made observations that back this up in a peculiar way. That they would say that a number of their patients, this is a quote, who present in the consulting room present as detached from their bodies and seem close to unaware of the most basic courtesies. Purpose-driven, plugged into their media, these patients pay little attention to those around them. In others, they seek what is of use, an echo of that primitive world of parts. Their detachment is not aggressive. It is as though they just don't see the point. And I think we could all relate to this just through, because almost everyone, of course, is participating in these experiences, but how when you spend a lot of time online, you can develop this kind of an attitude where you don't really have to be bothered and to interact with people. And you experience a certain kind of freedom through that, but also a kind of isolation, which is necessary for it. And that can then easily bleed over or just carry over into our daily life and kind of determine it in the way that Sherry Turkle describes here. There's another level of this tendency to isolate, though, which is important to lift into consciousness. And I think that it is possible to observe this through basic introspection, just basic self-observation and on ourselves. But it's also possible to try to approach it with a more schooled inner observation. In episode 4, I speak about contemplative knowledge practices that can lead in that direction. And what happens when we try to observe what is the effect of the medium of digital technology on our constitution? Contrary to what we might first think, it's possible to observe, and this, of course, is shared in the spirit of that it could be checked by other people who are interested and willing to try to make these observations. But there's a certain weakening of a spiritual dynamic that makes up part of our everyday life. From perceiving one another to perceiving our environment to having feelings and also memories, which is just a kind of intangible part of who we are which is weakened in a way. And I don't want to say that to demonize technology. It's certainly not of interest to me. Just like anything, you have to look from the whole perspective in order to make a value judgment. And I would like to say, if we're learning to ride a bike, part of riding a bike is falling down. And there you can hurt yourself, but it's part of learning how to find a right balance with the bicycle. And I think in a similar way, technology right now, it's important to try to understand it in its wholeness and its relationship to human life and experience, and then hopefully to be able to come into right relationship with it. Right now, I think we are in a kind of process of a lot of falling down, which makes sense because it is a very new development. But one of the things that comes out of this, just simple introspection, basic sociological research, and also kind of contemplative inquiry, is that this technology, which we think of as kind of expanding our consciousness and leading us out beyond the normal bounds of existence, which it certainly does, at the same time, it actually has the paradoxical effect that it isolates us and in a way weakens our ability to connect, which there's a kind of contradictory character in the whole situation. Okay, but this isn't the only place where really radical opportunities for the expansions of consciousness are unfolding today. And at this point, it's interesting to consider that in Silicon Valley, where we have the kind of heart of the digital technological revolution in the last half century, there's another kind of consciousness expanding opportunity which is emerging, and now emerging again quite strongly, and that's the use of psychedelic substances. Now, this is really interesting because it's interesting to read in the news or also in tech magazines that it's in Silicon Valley that we find also a lot of interest in not only technology but also psychedelics, and that they're being brought together in a way. And this is very interesting to consider because, you know, the kind of digital virtual reality isn't necessarily a great experience for people, and it often doesn't fill them with vitality and enthusiasm. But this is quite different from the experiences that many people have when they take psychedelic drugs. And I'd like to just characterize this. I mean, if we look at kind of digital imagery and the digital horizon of expansion that we can enter through technology, while it offers a huge possibility for expansion, it also has a kind of drying out and isolating effect on one level, which leads to a quite dissatisfied experience for those who might want to spend a lot of time in virtual reality, for instance. The experience of taking psychedelic drugs, on the other hand, is runs in exactly the other direction. Now, of course, how people experience those things are widely different, but I'd like to focus on some of the more powerful possibilities. And I'm just going to actually read a quote from the popular book about the subject and the kind of renaissance in psychedelic research which is going on right now that Michael Pollan wrote, called How to Change Your Mind. And in it, he talks about how powerful these images are. He didn't understand why the experiences that many people have on drugs leave such a powerful impression, and why people didn't just write them off as a dream or as some kind of flimsy drug-induced hallucination. Quote, "I didn't understand why you wouldn't simply file it under interesting dream or drug-induced fantasy." And then he goes on to write how it had a feeling of ineffability. William James, quote, "gave a name to this conviction, the noetic quality." And this conviction was that you had come into contact with some profound objective truth. So psychedelic experiences they don't always, but they can have, in a way, a totally opposite effect than the experiences that we have of digital images, which is that they're almost filled with being itself, and their power is utterly convincing, and also the reality that they feel like they're communicating. Now, it is, of course, clear that in the future, there's going to be more and more interest in experimenting with bringing together the possibility to expand consciousness through psychedelics and the possibility to expand consciousness through digital technology. And in a way, they complement one another. Maybe digital technology can give a huge architecture for consciousness, but somehow it doesn't provide the right tone of life. But maybe through the use of psychedelics, some kind of complementary movement can be brought in. But it's not only psychedelics which is being considered in this way, but even a kind of direct influence of the brain. It could be through irradiating certain regions of the brain with different frequencies or even electrical pulses. There are many ways that we might, affect the physical body and then combine that with kind of technology in order to kind of intensify and amplify the power of digital virtual reality possibilities. But, I think it's interesting to step back here. I mean, if we have young people growing up and they kind of experience, they're walking a line between kind of this highly pressurized, urgent, ecological, social reality on the one hand, and on the other hand, this possibility to expand one's consciousness through technology, but also through either taking physical substances or directly influencing the physical body, if it's the nervous system, for instance, in order to expand one's consciousness. And this is a very dramatic double movement. And one of the obvious moving and dramatic parts of this is that a young spiritually striving person, as we see in the youth movements right now, which are highly focused actually on collective issues related to climate change, ecological crisis, economic justice, and also social justice, where the heart of many young people and their actions are really to reform and to make an impact, a positive impact on the future of the world. They have the values of our collective life on the earth at heart. This is what they care about. And yet, on the one side, it can be paralyzing to feel this pressure and urgency of the situation and to have so much awareness of it through the constant, what's sometimes called the 24-hour news cycle. And also the effects, the kind of isolating effects of the digital revolution. And on the other side, this almost escapist attraction of expanding consciousness, but in such a way that it seems to weaken our ability to make terrestrial, earthly, valid, sober judgments. And this kind of tension, this dramatic tension of a kind of disillusion and a contraction, it is very moving to see young people trying to work towards earthly values for the good in collective issues. Collective issues certainly have to do with our collective sharing of the earth, and they certainly have to do with the social organization of our life together in civil society, but also in states of all different kinds. The drama is palpable. And if we then ask, what is a challenge that grows out of this situation for young people with spiritual interests? And this challenge, I think, could be articulated as such. Can we find ways to expand our consciousness in such a way that it does not weaken and it does not undermine our ability to make judgments, sober judgments, and realistic judgments in our normal everyday life on the earth? Can we find that kind of a spirituality in self-development, which doesn't tend towards any kind of escapism, and which we can integrate into our understanding of the world? Ideally, it would even strengthen our ability to make judgments in normal life. There's another side to that, however, which is to find a spirituality where the feeling of pressure and fate and absolute determinacy of the future, which I think a lot of young people feel as a kind of paralyzing effect, where everything is governed by kind of iron laws of nature, and there's not a possibility actually to make a positive change through our actions and our intentions, or a spiritual dimension of the universe and of the world. And I think this is the other side of the spiritual challenge, which is to try to expand how we understand nature, how we understand the human being, and even society, so that we can start to be sensitive to the fact that there are spiritual dimensions at play here as well, and that these spiritual dimensions can inspire us with some real powers of hope and of courage and motivation for working together. So, the dynamic that young people are growing up in today between contraction and expansion is begging a question. It's begging the question if a spirituality can be developed where we can expand our consciousness, but in such a way that we don't weaken our ability to make normal judgments and to work effectively in the world we share. And on the other hand, that we can start to look out at the world and life that we participate in and start to notice that there's more there than we have assumed before. This is a tall order, but it is certainly one reason why young people might be interested in exploring anthroposophy. And I offer it in that spirit. This is a project which is a collaboration with the Goethe Annum TV and the communications team here at the Goethe Annum. And one of the goals of this project is, of course, to make contributions to conversation around the spiritual striving of young people today. But it's also to try to build a cosmopolitan youth access and project fund. And if you make a contribution, every contribution helps and goes a long way. It will go towards supporting scholarships and also projects of young people who are connected to the youth section around the world. There's a global network of youth groups and projects, and we certainly need the support. And you can count on most of the support going towards youth work. The production costs of Questions of Courage are quite low. Thank you for joining me.